Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Sarrouf. Joining me today is Brandon Weichert, who is a national security analyst at the National Interest, a consultant for the U.S. Department of Defense and various other institutions that deal with geopolitics, technology development, and foreign policy. He's the author of this new book, A Disaster of Our Own Making, How the West Lost Ukraine, which is about, of course, the Russia and Ukraine war and to the history that produced it. Brandon's a very engaging speaker and storyteller, so we hope you enjoy the episode.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Brandon, thanks for joining me on the podcast, and congratulations on this new book. Beautiful title, beautiful cover. Great to be chatting with you.
Great to be here. And a fun little fact, that cover, we went back and forth. I had like 6 different versions. And finally I talked to people like Chadwick Moore, and he was like, you got to go with that one. That one's great. And I was like, well, he would know. So I went with the one he suggested.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it, very much clearly describes or is a picture of what's going on. Yeah. But before we get into the war itself, the book, of course, is A Disaster of Our Own Making, How the West Lost Ukraine. We got to go back, I think, and talk about some of the history of what surrounds this conflict. And I'll start with a question that I asked another interviewee or another guest on the show. How far back do you have to go before things no longer matter? But like, how far back do you go to start understanding the historical roots of the dynamics at play within Russian and European history?
Well, that's a great question, because I think I make it clear in the book that, I mean, you can really go all the way back to Catherine the Great and even kind of before. People say Vladimir Putin is like totally Hitler. And I say, no, he's like totally Peter the Great or Catherine the Great. He's really not that much different from previous Russian strongmen, and he's certainly not as bad as Stalin, thank God. But I think for the purposes of looking at the current war, I think all you need to do is look to the end of the Cold War. And as I say in the book, the seeds for the next great war are often found at the end of the last great war. And there were decisions made, mostly by the United States and NATO, that basically set the conditions for this disaster of our own making. The Russians were broken. The Russians were a lot like the Germans at the end of World War I. They had no real agency. They were just trying to survive daily. It was really the hands of the unipolar power, the United States, which at that time was the unquestioned hegemon in the world. We made certain decisions and we engaged in certain policies, NATO expansion being one of them, but also critically, the decision to force our so-called allies in Ukraine to abandon the 300-plus nuclear weapons that the Soviets left behind, to dismantle those weapons. And as I argue in the book, that had we, and I know this is something that J.D. Vance's team has argued recently as well, had the United States just left well enough alone and told the Ukrainians, rather than dismantling, we'll help you create better safeguards for that arsenal, had we just done that, we would have probably deterred any future aggression from Russia. But as I document in the book, the Americans, the British, the Russians, the Ukrainians, they all had their own agenda. And not only when they did this agreement to get rid of the nukes, but the Russians and the Americans, there were translation errors in the treaty. So the Russians thought there were certain things that were said by the Americans, and the Americans thought there were certain promises made by the Russians, and the translations were all wrong. And then you translated into the Ukrainian dialect, and there were other issues as well. So there was a comedy of errors, all of which led to the disarmament of Ukraine. And because of that, it's always been an inviting target. And then you throw in NATO expansion, where they want to go into Ukraine. Do not doubt me when I say the West wants to go into Ukraine. They want to absorb it into NATO and the EU. And Putin knows that. And he's not going to let it happen. And any more than we would let Mexico join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is sort of Russia and China's version of NATO. It would never happen. We go to war over that. And it's the same thing with Russia.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think we'll get into some of the political dynamics, but so if we're going to the end of the Cold War, and you're laying out there's this agreement Ukraine is going to give up nuclear weapons. What's the triangular exchange between what Ukraine's doing, what Russia was expecting with the treaty, and then what America had offered? Because I think a lot of this is a history of broken promises, or
it is.
So maybe you could describe that more.
Yeah, lost dreams and broken promises. Sounds like a Bruce Springsteen song. But the Ukrainians, what they really needed is they were even more of a failed state at the end of the Cold War than was the Russians. So what they really needed was economic guarantees, and they needed economic guarantees, and they needed assistance for the rebuilding post-Cold War Ukraine. And so what they did was they said, hey, look, we're going to use their nukes as leverage to get foreign aid from from the Americans. And so they leveraged that. And what they got in exchange was not only foreign aid, but they also got an informal, actually, it was probably more of a formal guarantee than people realize from the Clinton administration that the United States, defend them if the Russians ever came knocking on their front door again. And for the Russians, they didn't know any of that was going on. They were fine under Boris Yeltsin. They were fine with Ukraine being an independent country for the first time in a long time. The Russians just said, please keep it neutral. Do not go into NATO. Do not become part of a defensive alliance whose existence we no longer understand because we're not Soviets anymore. We thought that the NATO existence was about stopping Soviet aggression into the Western Europe. So why are you still continuing, and why are you trying to expand this even closer to us?
That makes sense. And then a minute ago you said Putin is not like Hitler or Stalin, but more like Peter the Great or Catherine the Great. What does that entail?
Well, what it means is that there's always going to be a degree of paranoia. There's always going to be brutality, both directed mostly inward at his own people. There's always going to be brutality directed at some of his neighbors that he thinks are getting too big for their britches. There's also, linked to the paranoia, there is an understandable historical Russian fear ever since the Mongol invasions 1,000 years ago of being encircled and dismembered by rival states. And so that's playing into Putin's calculation. In fact, Putin is a creature of history, contrary to the fact that he was brought up in the Soviet system, which was a communist system. But he is a student of history, and one of his closest intellectual fathers, you could say, was none other than Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who, of course, survived the Soviet gulags, and in the 90s was very influential for Putin and his political party in terms of shaping their view on foreign policy, as was a guy named Yevgeny Primakov, who was sort of the Henry Kissinger of Russia. And Primakov is one of the intellectual godfathers of the current Russian strategic, disposition, which is to never allow for enemy alliances to form on the other side of Russian borders.
Okay, and how does the transition from the 90s with the Yeltsin government in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union then transition to Putin and his government in the early 2000s, and then kind of how that history electorally within Russia has played out and how that's been affected by the foreign policy or these sorts of dynamics that you're describing?
Yeah, so basically Boris Yeltsin comes in and he's very pro-American, he's very pro-Western, very pro-democracy, pro-capitalism. And basically for 10 years, the 90s, Russia's a disaster, it's a mess. And they cannot get their act together. The people are annoyed, they're angry. Russia looks like it's being pushed around by the West, even though it's in this weakened position. Western economic analysts are not able to basically kind of prompt the kind of capitalism or neoliberalism that they think is going to save Russia. And so there's a reaction to it after 10 years in the form of Vladimir Putin and his Siloviki, which are sort of these security experts from the Soviet era who were more conservative and didn't like Yeltsin and thought he was an embarrassment and thought that he was giving away the store to the rest of the world in Russia. And in some cases he was. And so they were elevated on the promise, for lack of a better way of saying it, to make Russia great again. And the Russians are great people and they want to be great. And so they said, look, we gave the Americans 10 years to help us out, and it seems like they're doing more damage than help. So we're going to turn to our own people that say they can do better. And that was sort of the basis of Putin. Remember, Putin was the bag man for the mayor of St. Petersburg for many years in the 90s, and he proved himself as a hyper competent technocrat, and he was. And things were going badly in the mid 90s, and so Yeltsin reached out to the mayor of St. Petersburg and said, I need people to help me in Moscow because Moscow's falling apart. And the mayor of St. Petersburg, perhaps he was being leveraged, blackmailed, but he said, I'll send you my guy Putin, and the rest is, as they say, is history. But people don't realize how bad it was in Russia. And the allure of Putin was that he was a skilled, competent, educated technocrat who could make things better. And in many respects, he did. Compared to where it was in 1992 to where it was in 2002, his second or third year in office, things were getting better. Even today, as the war rages, Russia is standing on its own and things are going well. I just spoke with somebody not long ago who just got back from Moscow, and she was telling me that, at least for Moscow, which, you take from that what you will because it's the capital, but she said, and she's a lifelong Russian. She goes, I've never seen it more vibrant. She said the cultural life is second to none now, and she's an artist by training. And she said that, I've never seen it like this. The art life, the music life, it's like a whole new renaissance is at play in Moscow. And she attributed it to the war kind of being this weird, like, rejuvenation to some degree of the Russian heritage and culture. Now, I'm not saying I support the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I don't. But ultimately, Putin came in. He was a rejuvenator, and he did that.
Thinking about Russian history, I'm reminded of the Potemkin village. And I think that this was kind of raised when Tucker Carlson went over for his interview with Putin. Is that a possibility for what's happening? Is there this is like the information warfare, or?
Absolutely. And that's always at play. And I always tell people, and I even push back on her. I was like, yeah, but what about outside the city? She said, well, I didn't go outside the city. She said, but I have heard from family members, she's a family of hers, that it's very bad in Kursk, which is where the Ukrainians invaded recently. She said that, but it's always bad on the border. So take from that what you will. But even in the Soviet times, there were pockets of okayness at times in places like Irkutsk, places in the Far East that weren't always under the brutal thumb of the Russians or under Moscow. But yes, so there's information warfare is everywhere, and the Russians are masters of it, and they are not our friends, and they are not trying to tell the truth to the West anymore. At the same time, though, we do have to understand that for the Russians, Ukraine is an existential fight, and so they will do whatever it takes to win that war, no matter how bloody and how brutal. And Putin, they believe, even though there is, this person told me in Moscow that, she said it reminded her of when she lived in the United States during the Iraq War, where people were very deeply divided in 2003 to 2008 or whenever, where families were divided, people were fighting. She said, and yet the country continued on. And she said that's sort of like what it is right now in Russia, where there is real upset that there's a war going on, but now they're of the mind we have to win it. And Putin is their guy. And they have problems with Putin, but Putin is their guy. And so it is, I once likened Putin to George W. Bush, and that was not a favorable comparison. Kurt Mills brought this up in the foreword of the book. I still think there's hints of like a Russian George W. Bush there, where he's just going to cling on, and he's gonna bust through whatever opposition to the war there is, and he's gonna do what he has to do, and he will probably win because, and I think he will win because he has more people, he has more troops, he has more tanks, more bombs, more guns. He has a much more vibrant defense industrial base, and he's basically able to just attrite the Ukrainians who have lost, I think, almost half of their population either to refugee flows out of the country or to being killed in this horrible war. At some point, the Ukrainians will not be able to sustain themselves.
Well, maybe let's turn to Ukraine in terms of getting to the history of how we got here, specifically looking to Ukraine. Historically, part of Russia, kind of the cultural and civilizational uh, foundation of what the modern Russian state or civilization would become starts in sort of Ukrainian territory. But after the Cold War, it becomes an independent, sovereign state. Could you tell us, about the sort of history of Ukraine since basically the 90s, and then feel free to bring in whatever pre-1990s, end of the Soviet Union history that's relevant or you think we should know about?
Well, Ukraine in the 90s was, like I said, as much of a mess as Russia was, if not more. They, until very, very recently, they were considered the most corrupt country in Europe, one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And their democracy was barely functional. A lot of rigging was going on even before 2004. But it sits on a lot of natural resources, and so Ukraine will always be a point of interest for the great powers of the world. In 2004, during the Orange Revolution, there was the pro-Russian candidate and the pro-American or pro-NATO candidate, and there was Putin claimed that, and I think he was right, there was a CIA operation to basically rig the election against the pro-Russian candidate, and Putin believed that that was a violation of the agreement that was made between NATO and Russia and Ukraine at the end of the Cold War, which is in exchange for Ukraine not going or being left alone, that they would be neutral. And he believed that that was a violation. Now you could counter that by saying, hey, Russia shouldn't have been meddling either. But to be fair, the gentleman in question for the pro-Russian party, he really wasn't pro-Russia per se. He just was sort of skeptical about the EU and NATO and getting too close to them. He came from the Russian-speaking eastern portion of Ukraine, which is one of the reasons why his party was affiliated with Moscow entities. To be clear, it was not an independent party completely, but as we saw later on with this gentleman, basically the election was rigged against him, but then he came back, and he comes back several years later, and he ends up winning an election, and he ends up being one of the considered in 2010, I believe it was 2010, he was considered the least corrupt Ukrainian politician out there, and he actually did some good. And then 2010 is also the period, though, in which the lease on the Sevastopol Russian naval base, where the Black Sea Fleet is located, and I talk about this in the book. It's a little known thing, but I remember it vividly. The Russian Black Sea Fleet is based in Crimea, in Sevastopol. After the Cold War, that all became Ukraine, but yet the Ukrainian government said, hey, we'll lease this back to you, Russia, in exchange for you training alongside us and basically continuing to secure the Black Sea with us. In 2010, that lease was coming up, and the Americans, with their proxy in Kyiv, John McCain was one of the architects of this attempt when he was a senator. He attempted to leverage this new pro-American government in Kyiv to cut that lease, drop the lease, and basically forever cut the Russians out of the Black Sea, which, going back to Peter the Great, actually, the quest for warm water ports has been a Russian imperial objective. And, this is never going to go away because the Russians believe they need access to warm water, and the Black Sea is one of their oldest fleets. It's one of their most legendary fleets. That whole, architecture out there was actually built in Ukraine by Catherine the Great and Colonel Potemkin, of which the Potemkin villages are named after. And so that's been since the 1800s a Russian military enclave. And so the Russians at that point became aware, not only in 2004 had they experienced this color revolution, which ousted the pro-Russian candidate, but then a few years later in 2010, the Americans attempted to leverage that pro-American candidate in Kyiv to cut them out of their base in Sevastopol. Now, that candidate in Kyiv realized, I can't do this, that's crazy, and so he backed away. But that left a very bad taste in Putin's mouth, and he knew what was afoot here. And this quest for warm water ports, this gets back to a deeper issue in Russian history. There's 4 major warm water ports. Only one of them is in Russia proper, and that's Vladivostok along the Pacific. Okay, so that's on the underdeveloped Russian Far East. You then got the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. You've got the Baltic Sea Fleet, and then you've got in Syria, you've got the facility at Tartus. And as I pointed out in the book, there is a pattern of American and NATO military moves that appear to be directed against these 3 Russian warm water ports, notably the Black Sea port in Sevastopol, but also one of the main reasons that Obama was supporting the head-chopping jihadists in Syria against Assad was because Assad was a client of Russia, and they knew if they could get Assad out of power and replace him with, even if it was an ISIS member, they thought they would be able to replace him with somebody who would kick the Russians out of Tartus and deprive them of access to the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. So you see this sort of, I liken it to that, a high school student drinking for the first time, playing Risk at the same time. It's very two-dimensional strategic thinking. And this is Washington's elite, though, on display. This is what they view the world as a giant risk board. And so between the Eastern Mediterranean port in Syria and the Sevastopol port, Putin saw this in a short time span and was like, well, they're coming for me now. And then he witnessed what happened in Libya. And he mentioned that in one of his tirades where he said that they're going to do to me what they just did to Gaddafi. And I don't think he's necessarily wrong. If given the opportunity, I think the Americans and Ukrainians would. And so he's now pushing back. And that led us into 2014, where yet again there was a CIA color revolution attempt against the pro-Russian candidate. And it was successful this time. And at that point, Putin said, I'm done. And that's when he sent in the little green men who were Russian troops, but they didn't wear insignias of any kind. They solidified the hold in Sevastopol. They did a referendum there, and they got basically the majority of the people in Crimea to vote to leave Ukraine and become part of Russia. And then he solidified his hold on eastern Ukraine. And that leads us into the current situation that leads us into 2022. And as I document in the book, there were a series of provocations that the United States made during the Joe Biden administration that basically ensured that this was going to happen, that a war would happen. And there's even some evidence to suggest that the idiots at the Pentagon thought that this would be the best way to break the Russian army in the field, goad them into war in Ukraine, and then we'll break the Russian army in the field.
Before we get to the war, I do have one more question. So we have Ukraine, and I think probably a lot of people know by now, and I didn't know this until the war basically kicked off, but the culturally kind of divided between Russians in the East, like the Russian or more pro-Russian East, and the more, not just even politically pro-European West, but they're like more historically like identified with the Europeans as opposed to like historic Russia. How does that shape Ukrainian electoral politics?
Well, and this goes back to Catherine the Great. So now we're going even, we're having to go back. I don't want to confuse your audience, but we do have to go back a little bit further than the Cold War, because to understand Eastern Ukraine, it has to do with the Russian colonization of the region under Catherine the Great. The Russians, and then of course Stalin further depopulated the region during his time, forced a lot of the ethnic Ukrainians, or the Tatars, out of Eastern Ukraine and replaced them with Siberians, Russians from the eastern part of Russia. But since the 18th century, Eastern Ukraine has been predominantly Russian. They speak Russian. They are culturally Russia. As the woman I was speaking to from Moscow told me, many of the people in Moscow, they have wives or husbands who are from Eastern Ukraine. They have grandmothers and sons who live in Eastern Ukraine. So, Eastern Ukraine, it may not be part of Russia officially, but culturally and genetically, even, it is definitely Russian. And there's and familial, in terms of familial ties as well. So the Russians were never going to let that region completely be independent. But again, this was known in the 90s. This was not like this was news. When this happened, the people who crafted the treaty in the 90s understood that Russia was going to have some kind of oversight over parts of Russia. And we were supposed to be okay with that, and we indicated we would be. But it has since, of course, been determined that it's too problematic, as the kids say these days. But of course, that means now we're courting nuclear war. And as even Bob Woodward has shown in his new book, when I was warning a year and a half ago and people at the Pentagon were laughing at me, they were looking at me like I had three heads. Well, it turns out, according to Bob Woodward, about a year and a half ago, Putin was very close to pushing the nuclear button. That's how serious this situation is over eastern Ukraine and Crimea. And so they're Russian. That's just the way it is.
Yeah, I guess the counter argument that I could imagine, and I wonder what you think, is, there's an element, like, the borders are not precise, and this is kind of the problem with nationalism, is when you're drawing borders, some of your people that fit within the historic nation get left out. And then you have these other people who aren't in your nation that are in the borders. But the borders also exist for a reason. That's, sort of a big rallying cry in America today, is our border is wide open, and you have people coming here from all over the place, and they don't share our values or our way of life and things of this sort. But, at what point do we have to say, okay, there are Russians who are in Ukraine, and there's this very closely entangled history between the two sovereign states, but Putin, your claims over this territory, over the care for these people, things have changed. Sorry. So this would be, I guess, the argument.
It is the argument that people say, and all I can say is what's said on paper is very different from what's said in practice. This is sort of the difference between the theorist and the practitioner, right? Everybody understands, and by the way, I think, at least on paper, Putin would agree that borders are borders and they should be recognized and respected. But at the same time, there's the reality of the situation, which is Russia is a major nuclear power. In fact, their nuclear weapons arsenal is larger and now more sophisticated than our own, thanks to the 2010 New START deal. The Russians are saying, hey, look, we want to respect national borders too, but we're not the ones who went in and tried to flip Ukraine completely in the American camp. We're not the ones who went in and tried to, make Ukraine part of Russia again. We didn't do that until we were pushed. And that's the Russian position. And so my point here is, yes, we should always, on paper, say national borders must be respected, and they should be. At the same time, in practice, there are certain realities on the ground that transcend newer or modern agreements, and that some measure of respect should be given. Not that Russia had a right to take over Ukraine, but that Russia, there's a large population of Russians in eastern Ukraine. The Russians have a military standing in Sevastopol that goes 200 years into the past. They're not going to give it up without a fight. It's not worth a fight. We could have just lived and let live, and the Russians wouldn't have tried to take the rest of Ukraine. We wouldn't be in the position we're in had we just left well enough alone, which is sort of the point I'm making. Putin did not wake up and say, I'm going to take Kyiv. What happened was Putin woke up and said, the Americans are trying to encircle me again, and my borders are smaller than what they were during the Cold War. And if they can push me out of places like Syria and Kaliningrad and Sevastopol, then I'm going to be reduced to my borders from the Middle Ages of Russia's history, which were indefensible borders, which means that the Russian state as a whole collapses, which then leads Putin into a conclusion, which is that the Americans are trying to use asymmetrical capabilities and methods to collapse the Russian state. Now, I used to think that was a conspiracy theory on his part until I found the papers, the white papers from the 90s, where there were multiple think tanks in the West, reputable think tanks, who were writing about this. People at Hudson Institute. I have found out from people who were at the National Geospatial Intelligence Center in Charlottesville that people from Hudson Institute in 2005, very prominent people you would know who are on Fox News all the time, actually went to a closed briefing at NGIC and outlined how they were going to collapse the Russian Federation using non-military means, an encirclement strategy. And that's frightening because not only is that insane, but that also reaffirms Putin's worst fears, which puts Putin then into this fight or flight response with nukes. And therefore, I say again, it's a disaster of our own making. None of this was necessary. Putin didn't have to come to be had we just played better with Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin in the 90s wanted to be our friend. Boris Yeltsin wanted his Russia to be democratic, capitalistic. He wanted it to be a doorway for America and the West into Eurasia. Now under Putin, it has become a doorstop. And the reason it is there that way is explicitly because of the policies I'm talking about here.
So there's a lot there to unpack. Because one thing I remember you wrote in the book is that Putin, when he first came to power, was also, he was fine with the United States and fine with Ukraine as an independent nation, and even not then joining NATO, but I think even there was, maybe I misread this, that Russia even made a bid to join NATO or the EU or something like that.
In Bill Clinton's final year, his first meeting with Putin was Bill Clinton's final year as president, and it was a very frosty meeting between the two men. But one thing that Putin did was he was trying to be, very self-effacing to Clinton. He was trying to make it clear, I am not a Soviet apparatchik in disguise. I want to also be friends with America. I just want Russia to be stronger and more prosperous than it is. And one of the things he pulled Bill Clinton aside, there's actual video of it. They're walking out of a meeting room, going down these stairs, and Putin pulls on Clinton's arm, and they start talking for 5 or 10 minutes very intensely. And that was Putin trying to pitch, hey, look, if you're this serious about keeping NATO together, even though it makes no sense now that the Soviet Union is gone, why not just bring us into it then, and let's make it a truly Russo-American new world order, and we can basically dominate the world together. And Bill Clinton laughed at him and went, oh, yeah, okay. And he kind of was very dismissive, and he walked away. That was, some people say it wasn't a serious pitch. I think there was probably a degree of just probing to see what the American would do. But I think that if Clinton had taken him up on his offer, I think it would have been a very different world. At the very least, there was also my old professor, Dick Farkas, used to talk about this when I was an undergrad. He was a Sovietologist for, I think, the CIA or one of those agencies back in the day. He used to say, it's really too bad in the 90s we didn't just disband NATO and put all the resources into the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Economic Cooperation in Europe, and that Russia was already a member. So we could have disbanded NATO and just put everything into OSCE, taken a step back from Europe to focus on other strategic priorities, and therefore the Russians would have felt like, okay, we can get along now. But the fact of the matter is that we treated Russia like they were inconsequential, like the Russian Federation was transitory, and that they were transitory toward a total and final collapse of the Russian state, which is a non-starter for any Russian leader. It doesn't matter if it's Boris Yeltsin or Putin or Medvedev or whoever comes after Putin. They're not going to sit over the dissolution of the Russian state.
Yeah, and from their perspective, why would they? And it does sound like a conspiracy theory in one sense, except we've done it a number of times. We've done regime change.
Absolutely, we did it in Ukraine.
Yeah, and I guess the difference is that Russia is a great power, and Iraq was not a great power, or
that's right,
Afghanistan or Libya. But
this is why, by the way, countries like North Korea say we're not giving up nukes. There's no way, because you're even trying it on Russia, which is insane. Most of the rest of the way, this is, by the way, why the BRICS countries are now saying we don't want to be on the US dollar, because the Americans have shown they will not stop until a country they view as an evil, authoritarian state is collapsed. And the rest of the world, there are many authoritarian states in the world, and they're saying, we're not going to let that stand. If you can do that to Russia, if you can try to collapse Russia with nukes on board, collapse them, or if you try to annex, as we tried to do, the Russian sovereign wealth fund because of the Ukraine war, then we without nukes are never going to be safe. And this is why you have proliferation. This is why you have things like the attempt to collapse the US dollar, which I think is coming. But this is why. It's because of our own imperial actions.
I mean, we've been talking for over 30 minutes. We haven't even gotten into the actual war yet, or even the lead up. But I do have one question, because you've laid out a great case, I think, for how NATO expansion and our aggressive pushes towards encircling and weakening Russia's geostrategic position would lead Putin to lash out, and that could be a casus belli, so to speak, a cause for war.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, we also know that Putin does have this sort of Peter the Great, Catherine the Great desire to, if not reconquer, but to have exceeding influence in historic parts of what was a mighty Russian empire, part of this making Russia great again sort of thing. So there's it seems like on the one hand there's a defensive aspect to Putin's action, and then on the other hand, like he wrote, I think, his grad thesis on this theme of like trying to reconstitute the old Soviet Union, not along communist,
along imperial Russian lines,
along imperial historic Russian lines. So how do we, in our assessment, how do we balance those two things?
Yeah, well, and this is where, as much of a critic as I've been, the one thing that the U.S. initially aid to Ukraine did was it slowed down the Russian advance. And I think had it been an easy cakewalk for them into Kyiv, you probably would have seen Russia trying to do something against Transnistria, or maybe trying to do something against Serbia. Maybe. There's also, though, a friend of mine who's no longer with us, Angelo Codavia, and I lean a lot toward his assessment nowadays. He made the claim that, look, Russia in the 1950s was fundamentally different from Russia in the 2020s. Russia back in the day really had a robust population base. They were galvanized. They had this expansionistic ideology that was going to go beyond any border in the world that wasn't communist. They wanted to be the top dog in the world. It was revolutionary. The Russians today, yes, they certainly have this sort of cagey imperialism, but they recognize, especially after having been sort of fighting now for 3 years, it wasn't supposed to be a 3-year-long war, and that's because Putin did not plan this war properly. But that's another story. But there is an argument that Codavia made, and I really think is true, which is that the Russians know they no longer have the population base. All they're trying to do now is create these buffer zones. They want neutrality regions around the Russian borders with countries in Europe, rather. Will they maybe now, because they've bled the Ukrainians, will they maybe try to go up to the Polish border? It's possible. It wouldn't have been possible had we just avoided this thing altogether. But the question of can Russia, does it have the juice to go beyond Ukraine? I don't believe they will for at least a decade after this, because the Russians are not invincible, and the Russians did not enter this war as stronger than America. They just entered the war as having a little bit more capabilities in terms of being able to withstand a heavy war better than the Ukrainians could. And so, in my opinion, is there a chance that he might try to go for broke? Maybe, but I don't think he's going to do that unless there's a really significant provocation, such as U.S. or NATO direct intervention that cannot be covered up. In that case, it's different. Or if the Americans help the Ukrainians really start targeting really sensitive infrastructure in Russia, at that point, it changes the calculation. But now, what I think will happen, either Zelensky wakes up and has a moment of come to Jesus moment, and he says, I got to make a deal, or he's going to bleed this on for 6 months to another year, maybe 2 years, but it ends with the collapse of the regime in Kyiv, and it ends with the Russians naturally walking into Western Ukraine. The goal of the American policymakers should be to avoid that, and you avoid that through diplomacy. because I don't think Putin really wants to go all the way. I feel like he's probably being pushed into it by circumstances. So the point is, let's change those circumstances now. But do I think that, yes, I think there's always an imperialist itch in the Russians. Do I think, though, that they will attempt that in short order after taking Ukraine? No. One way or the other, they're going to have to rehab what they've lost. And so there's going to be a timeline where probably things settle down, and Putin is not Hitler in that way either. You know, when the Germans took what they took in short order, that was because they were basically hitting mush. But if he goes in to Ukraine, there's Poland, and Poland is not mush. And Poland is not the Poland of the 1930s and 40s. This is a modern, advanced country, and they will fight to the death. And Putin knows that. There's no indication that he's really trying to do anything in Transnistria, which is the contested region in Moldova. Moldova is a weaker country than Poland. It's next to Ukraine as well. There's no indication. I mean, we saw indicators and warnings for a long time leading into the invasion in Ukraine. There is very little that indicates the Russians are trying to do anything there. So I think the concern of a Russian imperialist, run on Southern and Eastern Europe, I think that's overwrought.
Okay. I mean, the war itself, what's the state of the ground right now?
It's frozen. It's locked. It's locked with, in my opinion, things shifting against Ukraine. And it's shifting against Ukraine because, again, they're running out of people, they're running out of supplies, they're running out of money. And, the Russians, yes, the Russians are also, like I said, it's a war of attrition. So let's look at our war of attrition in Vietnam, or look at the Civil War here. War of attrition. It was bloody. It was brutal. We lost a lot of people too, but ultimately we had a bigger industrial base. Ultimately, we could survive it. The same thing is true of Russia. And the difference, for instance, between our war in Vietnam and the Russian war in Ukraine, in my opinion, is that Putin, being a master strategist, has married fairly well ends, ways, and means. Right? This was always the problem in the U.S. war of attrition in Vietnam. We could win every tactical situation that we got into, but we didn't have a strategy for victory. We didn't even know what victory looked like. Putin, in my opinion, his victory is simple. Create a buffer zone in Eastern and in Crimea, part of Ukraine, and then leave the West part of Ukraine, as a rump state. Make it neutral. He's made it very clear. I want a neutral Ukraine. And he's fine with an independent Ukraine as long as it's neutral. And so I think that's his goal, and I think that's a very attainable goal. The Ukrainian goal, meanwhile, their grand strategy is we're going to push every Russian out of eastern Ukraine and Crimea. Well, no, that's not how that's going to play out. That's just not possible. Even with all the NATO help in the world, it's not possible. You can't do it without risking World War III. And, by letting Zelensky drive the policy, as we have done, we are now risking World War III, because that is a red line for Mr. Putin. He's not going to let them push. And by the way, almost everybody in Eastern Ukraine is Russian on some level. So, like, what are we talking about here? We talking about ethnic cleansing? What are we talking about here? And then that gets us into some pretty disgusting, possibilities of what might be at hand here. And so, I think that the Russians can basically bleed out the Ukrainians. And once the Ukrainians have been bled out sufficiently, like I said, it could be 6 months, I think they have in them. If we're lucky, they have 2 years, but probably closer to 6 months. At that point, the war flips. Russia can then just walk in to the rest of Ukraine. But right now, those front lines are fairly static. And the Ukrainians are basically just throwing everything they can. I mean, you see that in the videos of these poor people at funerals and at churches going to Sunday Mass, being rounded up by Ukrainian military guys. Oh, you're military age. Get in there. Eventually they're not going to be able to do that. Eventually they're going to run out of people who can fight. And at that point, the front line will then collapse completely. Another thing with this Kursk invasion that they did, that was another, I've said from the beginning, the Ukrainians, whereas the Russians are waging a military campaign, the Ukrainians are basically waging a PR campaign. That invasion of Kursk involves something like 10,000 of the Ukrainians' best troops. They don't have a lot of troops. They moved their 10,000 best guys from one of the hardest fought regions of the front with the Russians, and they moved them to invade Kursk. Those guys were either completely decimated or they've been routed so much that they're no longer a fighting force. The Russians have reclaimed most of Kursk. They've gotten most of the Ukrainians out. And what that's going to do is allow the Russians now to punch even harder because they're going to be galvanized. The Ukrainians just lost a chunk of their best people, a lot of people they don't have. And so this was not a strategically sound move by Ukraine, but it was a PR move. It was to try to change the narrative in the West, which has been working slowly against Ukraine.
I'm curious, before we kind of talk about, well, what should we do, or what's the, how will this end? You've kind of given some indications of how you think it might go, and I want to hear what you think the sort of best path forward is. But before we do that, like an analytical question, how has the war changed the geostrategic, like the sort of the global picture in terms of not just American and Russian relations, which are very, very bad, but I'm thinking about China, which personally I see as a bigger challenge, if not a threat, but a challenge to the United States. But how has this war changed the sort of the calculus, the state of play in the great power competition?
Well, it's completely upended the entire, post-Cold War order. The one thing every Western geopolitical analyst going back to Sir Halford Mackinder in the late 19th, early 20th century has always said to American and British policymakers, do not let Eurasian powers coalesce together. That if you can get them together, then that's it for the maritime powers, the maritime democracies, Britain and America, because we can't compete with the population base, the resource base, the industrial base of Eurasia, of a combined Eurasia. Now, of course, Russia and China still have, differences. But I liken it in the book to sort of the Spartan, a league of the Peloponnesian League that went to war with Athens. They didn't like each other, those city-states, but they hated Athens because Athens for 20 years had been, or more than that, had been basically a-holes to the rest of the Greek city-states, and they kept pushing with this totalitarian form of democracy, and eventually Sparta stood up and was like, no, we're done, and you're done. And that's what's going on now with the Eurasians, is that the Americans have run roughshod over much of the rest of the world in the name, not of grand strategy, but in the name of democracy and human rights and the rainbow flag. And ultimately, that has triggered a response from the greatest, authoritarian powers in Eurasia. And they're saying, we're going to set aside our differences now, and we're going to work together to collapse the American empire so they can never again threaten us the way they've threatened us in the past. And they're very close to succeeding, because not only now has Russia combined basically its resource, industrial, and military base with China's base and economy, but now they're looping in other American enemies. It's sort of like the Injustice League. They're looping in now all the other baddies from around the world who are more than happy to jump on board because they want to collapse America too. So you now not only have a military alliance being birthed in Eurasia, but as I noted before, you have the birth of, and I hate using this term because it's actually not BRICS. It's just a Eurasian alliance. You now have, the so-called BRICS alliance forming, which they will collapse the US dollar. And they recognize, they never did it before. In 2008, Hank Paulson, who was the Secretary of Treasury during the recession, he met with his Chinese counterpart. And there's a very famous moment in which the Chinese counterpart says, Hank, the American debt load is a significant national security threat to you. And by the way, the Russians came to us in 2008 and tried to get the Chinese to work with Russia to collapse the US dollar by dumping simultaneously all their holdings of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mae stock when everything was crashing. The Chinese said, we're not going to do that. Now, it's a different game now. The Chinese believe America is in relative decline. I talk to a lot of Chinese, even pro-American Chinese. They think we're in relative decline. And so when you have that belief in your mind that your greatest rival is in decline and you're on the ascendance, that makes you, and then you have all these new partners coming on board, that makes you do certain things. And this is all because of the mismanagement, generally of post-Cold War American policy, but specifically of what happened in Ukraine.
Yeah, it sounds like the maximalist position has had the opposite effect as what was intended.
Absolutely. Absolutely it has. And, it's maximalism can work in certain cases, right? In certain cases it can work. But unless you're holding all the marbles, it doesn't work. Like in the late 40s, before the Soviets got the bomb, there's an argument that, hey, Americans really should have done more to basically be the hegemon after World War II, because we had all the resources, we had all the skilled labor, we had everything, but we let it slip away in a handful of years. So there's an argument for that historical moment. But now that everybody has nukes, and by the way, China has a amazing high-tech sector. I talk about it all the time. They are not just imitators, they're innovators as well. The idea that we can kind of hold our hand over the rest of the world and tell them what to do, those days are over. And by the way, it's not worth it. We've got so much stuff to worry about here, closer to home. We shouldn't be spending all these resources on a maximalist foreign policy, because it doesn't work, because it actually creates the enemies you're trying to stop.
Yeah, and then speaking of allies, what's the state of our alliance with NATO? How has the war changed America's relationship with the other NATO countries, Poland, Germany?
Well, Poland is, a unique case. Poland, understandably, has problems with Russia, and they're never going to go away. And so, in my opinion, Poland is the best country in Europe. I don't like the current government there. I think they're too globalist. But the previous government, the right-wing government, I used to do consulting work with. So I'm very, very sympathetic and very pro Poland. The U.S. relationship with Poland will always be there, I think. The general question of NATO, I think NATO is basically past its expiration date. It makes no sense. It is an antiquated alliance. And, you look at the countries involved. France and Germany are, 1 minute they're pro-Ukraine, the next minute they're opening up to China. There's no longer a unifying threat. When NATO was created, it was very simple. We want to stop a Soviet run on Western Europe. That was it. That was the simple ask. They were able to do that. When it was successful at the end of the Cold War, they should have disbanded it. But they didn't, because it's a bureaucracy. And anybody who studies bureaucracy knows bureaucracy's whole goal is to justify its own existence and to expand. And so that is all is it done. It has basically started to endlessly expand, and it has triggered the very response from post-Soviet Russia that it was supposedly meant to stop. And so our relationship with NATO, I guess on one level you could say it's very strong, because we keep pouring all these resources and they keep getting money and getting rich off of it. But the alternative is it's now become so big, and it's now become so amorphous and aimless that it doesn't make any sense. It's an alliance without a purpose, and it's looking for a purpose, and it's found some kind of purpose in starting a war with Russia. I liken it in the book. I say that, look, NATO was the hero in the Cold War, but today NATO looks a lot like the Warsaw Pact. Okay, it's an ideological alliance that's seeking to expand. It is not a defensive alliance of equals. It's now America telling the vassals what to do, and at some point the vassals are going to have a problem with that.
Well, we're probably coming towards the end, but I think my last question would be, where do we go from here? That's very broad, so I guess take that in any direction you'd like.
Where do we go? We need to get Trump into office, and we need to end this thing now. We need to reset relations with Russia, and we need to be done. We need to be done with Europe.
All right, very simple.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I got to go though.
All right, well, last thing would be if people want to follow more of your work as it's ongoing, where should they look?
You should look at Twitter at @WeTheBrandon at The National Interest, and you can find my work on Amazon. Any of my books, Biohacked, How China's Race to Control Life, A Disaster of Our Own Making, How the West Lost Ukraine, Winning Space, How America Remains a Superpower, and The Shadow War, Iran's Quest for Supremacy.
All right, well, thanks again, Brandon.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.